Good afternoon. It's actually an honor to follow Bob, and I have a somewhat similar talk. We had much more than 9 months, but maybe not quite as much money as his group did to do a analysis of climate impacts in the United States. Just to give you a sense of this is a work that was coordinated out of my office at the Environmental Protection Agency. I sit in a science branch that's on the policy side of the agency, so we don't do that much fundamental research ourselves, but we heavily leverage research which is done by the rest of the community in order to produce things that are relevant for ideally for the policymakers and the public. So there's a number of EPA collaborators here, and I also wanted to mention that the work couldn't be done without a number of external collaborators, most notably the MIT Joint Program on the Science and Policy of Global Change, but also Pacific Northwest National Labs, a number of contractors, and then a number of academics who work with those contractors. So when the EPA puts out a policy, we always do a cost-benefit analysis. The cost-benefit analysis for climate change policies relies on the social cost of carbon, which uses values for the benefits of CO2 reduction based on a couple of global integrated assessment models. So you get something like $30 a ton of CO2 multiplied by the number of tons reduced, and you get a benefit that you can compare to your costs, which is very useful for our purposes, but does not speak very well to people unless they're economists. So in our group, we wanted to do an analysis that would have sort of impacts that would be more relevant for people at the regional or national scale, looking at them both as the physical and the economic monetization of the impacts, because obviously there are a lot of uncertainties. We wanted to characterize those, and we wanted to have a system that would be consistent, where our emissions, our climate scenarios and all of that would have consistent use in the sectoral models, and that they would make the same economic assumptions all the way through. So we have a set of emission scenarios. I'll go into some more of the details on the next slide, but basically this is the standard framework of emissions, goes to concentrations, goes to climate changes, are used as inputs into sectoral models, and then the outputs of the sectoral models can either be represented in sort of the raw physical output, deaths or sea level rise or things like that. They can also be the economic damages, or they could be changes in risk. And I think we've seen some of this from the previous presentation. We also looked at a number of key ways to address uncertainty. So we have 3 different emission scenarios, a reference, and 2 mitigation scenarios. The reference is a bit warmer than RCP 8.5, and the mitigation scenarios are not entirely unlike RCP 4.5 and 2.7. I'll actually talk about the rest on the next slide, because we did our emissions using the MIT EPA model, computable general equilibrium model. And then for the climate, we use the MIT IGSM, which is an Earth system model, chemistry, ecosystems, oceans, the works, but it's a zonally resolved model. So that enables us to do things like modifying the climate sensitivity. So we did 4 different climate sensitivities using the model, along with 5 different initial conditions. So that plus the 3 emission scenarios means there were 60 full runs, which was good, but we also need to have obviously a geographically resolved model for output. So this is coupled to the NCAR community atmosphere model at a 2 by 2.5 degree resolution. In addition, we didn't want to be reliant solely on one pattern of output, especially for precipitation, and so a pattern scaling approach was used to emulate other models, those all based off of the, so rather than using MAGIC as our input for the pattern scaling, we were using the IGSM. You can see here the emissions for the reference and for the mitigation scenario divided by region, and you can also see the temperatures for the 4 different climate sensitivities for this, the reference and our the 4.5 emission scenario. And you can see that to reach sort of 4.5, we need to start reducing emissions fairly soon, but even in our reference scenario, emissions are beginning to level off by the end of the century. So we then look at a number of different impacts. As Bob said for his work, obviously we are not comprehensive. To a certain extent, we're doing the whole looking for our keys under the lamppost model of what's out there and available that we can do. Fortunately, a lot of people do prioritize what they work on based on what the most important impacts are. So, you know, we do include here temperature mortality and a number of other health impacts. We try to get, you know, infrastructure, energy demand, water resources, ag and forestry, and ecosystems. I'm going to just show a couple of the model outputs as an example, but there are a number more that are in the literature and that we will hopefully be presenting in various formats over the next year or two. So we also have a extreme temperature mortality analysis. We use a slightly different method from the risky business one. This relies on a paper by Medina, Ramon, and Schwartz that looked at the hottest 1% of days in the past 30 years and looked at the change in mortality resulting from those, actually hottest and coldest, using, I believe, nighttime temperatures were for the hot, and daytime temperatures for the cold had the most significant statistical strength, and then extrapolating out into the future. And so you can see that mortality is measured in deaths per 100,000, increases significantly over the century, that policy reduces that mortality. We also did a sensitivity analysis trying to take into account adaptation because one, we know that human population sensitivity to heat depends on location, so there's a different function for each of these 33 cities, but it has also changed over time, and in fact we have ongoing a new analysis that both expands the number of cities out to something like 150 counties, and uses an approach that rather than only looking at the hottest and coldest 1% actually sort of takes into account a much larger range of temperatures, and looks at how that mortality response has changed over time in the last 30 years in order to attempt to extrapolate out into the future. So I don't have those results to show yet, but we'll have those. We also looked at sea level rise. So this relies on the coastal property model of the EPA, which has basically coastal infrastructure at a fairly high resolution around the coast of the United States. The assumptions here, we use the MIT models, thermal expansion and glacial melt component, but add an additional component based on a more semi-empirical method for glacial, for the melting of the ice sheets, and looked at both the effects of sea level rise elevation directly, but also a storm surge model, I think, based on slosh. Cumulative discounted damages from this were more than 4 trillion over the century, but that was assuming no adaptation. So basically, if your house gets flooded, you abandon it and that's done. That's probably not realistic, so we also used a method where we did optimal adaptation, where you could choose to abandon property, build seawalls, nourish beaches, a number of other options. This is also not realistic in that I think we have seen that people don't perfectly adapt to sea level rise beforehand, or to storm surges, but in any case that reduces the damages to something more like 700 billion. Mitigation does not actually give us that much benefit here, because as we see most of the reduction, I think we heard this from last talk, the mitigation reduction of sea level rise mostly happens at the end of the century, and through the magic of discounting, that mostly disappears when you're doing a net discounted benefit. We could discuss whether or not that's the right way to do things, but we are part of the government, and there are certain requirements for how we approach our analyses. Oh, I also wanted to mention the number of these projects. We do attempt to look at socially vulnerable populations, and for this analysis, it was shown that the areas that were abandoned are obviously a lot of the ones that are less economically valuable, but those are also tend to be where people who are more socially vulnerable live, and so that's a decision society at some point will have to make as to, do we want to do the quote-unquote rational economic thing, or do we care about something other than just the straight economics? We've done some ecosystem work. This uses the combo model, which takes into account acidification and temperature change. The bleaching events are stochastic, so you can see as the sea surface temperature on a given week or month exceeds the threshold, you'll see a die-off of coral, and the total coral cover will reduce. The bad news, at least from this analysis, and I'm kind of hoping that we're wrong, is that the coral reefs in Florida and Puerto Rico are pretty much doomed regardless of what we do, but that at least the Hawaiian coral reefs can be saved to some extent through mitigation. We also did an energy demand analysis. We used 3 different models. This is one of the aspects of uncertainty that we wanted to at least explore a little bit, was different sectoral models can yield different results even with the same climate scenario, in addition to looking at obviously the potential 60 different physical scenarios that we had in our database. We didn't apply all of our sectoral models to all the climate output that we had, just because of lack of resources and time. But this is just an energy demand scenario. So some of the conclusions are pretty obvious. You expect mitigation provides monetary and risk reduction benefits, not for all sectors and not for all regions, but the net effect in all of our analyses was that we get sizable benefits that increase over time. Adaptation can reduce costs. And so the status of this work is there are 35 or so published papers that were in the development of all of these sectoral models. There's a special issue of climatic change. I think there's only 1 paper left that's still in the review process, so most of these are already available online and open access. And we intend to encompass more sectors, improve our analyses of the various sectors, possibly try and develop damage functions, and work on communicating the results to the community, which starts here, but obviously we're also aiming at less academic audiences, policymakers, and the public. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Marcus. And we do have time for a question. Bob, the floor is yours.
We used a discount rate of 3%, despite the fact that we actually do have an underlying economic growth from the EPA model. So we could have chosen to discount based on our growth rate. But we also don't have, obviously, the climate feedbacks don't go all the way into the economics model, so there'll be all sorts of questions that would arise there. But the property values do increase over time, yes.